I think we're all back from the lunch now, and we will continue with the program. And we have a very good panel here to discuss with us what needs to be done to make transparency possible. First, I would like to introduce our panelists. We have on the end side here, we have Idar Kreutzer. He's the Director of Finance, Norway. We have Hans Christian Holte, Tax Director at the Directorate of Taxes. We have Jon Lomøy, Director of the Norwegian Organization for International Development. And we have Trond Schea, Director of the Norwegian National Authority for Investigation and Prosecution of Economic and Environmental Crime. And these men are heading important institutions and organizations in society that each has the power to, we hope, to define and influence and shape the agenda on transparency, tax, and illicit financial flows. So in this panel, we will concentrate mainly on the issue of transparency and what needs to be done to make transparency possible. I'd like to start with our tax director, Hans Christian Holte. Given the institution that you head at the Directorate of Taxes and that you're also heading the Forum of Tax Administration, the FTA in the OECD, how can the Norwegian Tax Directorate contribute to making transparency possible?
Well, thank you for that quite big question, I must say. Also, thank you for this invitation. I think putting this on the agenda like this is part of what is actually important in the discussion on the international tax system and also the question about transparency. In my perspective, I think transparency has been evolving in the area of international taxes for the last 2-3 years, and that gives also looking at that development. I think that might give some of the answers to your question. I mean, what does it really, what kind of actions, what kind of happenings is actually moving or driving the development of transparency internationally? And in my opinion, it's an ambition that quite many different parts of society actually share, that we would like to have increased transparency. But then, if you look a bit closer, if you look on the what you could call maybe the pragmatic side, there are also some differences. There are also some differences in what you could call the views upon the speed and the of change when it comes to transparency. And just briefly pointing to the main drivers in my perspective, the first is the tax administrations, the institutions. They are part of that transparency work. We have, the last couple of years, we have moved towards automatic exchange of information, financial information from financial institutions. And also you have the country-by-country reporting, of course. And those are, now we have over 100 countries actually participating in the exchange of financial information. So that's one important change, which I already, I must say, see some good benefit from. Secondly, I also think what media in general and the leaks specifically has contributed to, that's also an important part of I would say, a common or a general move towards transparency in this field. And I also think both those two developments has also increased the, you could say, maybe not surprisingly, has increased the voluntary disclosure to the tax administration from Norwegian citizens when it comes to reporting reporting funds that maybe is abroad, for example. So there's several forces working at the same time, and I think, in my opinion, one of the most interesting discussions is what is the right way of moving forward. What's the kind of the right pace, and what's the right techniques to use to move towards transparency? Because I think it's quite simple to say, yes, we all benefit from, to some extent, more transparency, but we have to discuss the way forward a bit more precisely, I think.
When the problem issue at stake is that the access to data itself is limited, are you able at all to say something about the numbers we are talking about and what role transparency plays here?
I would be a bit cautious with numbers, I think. But I think we could, there are international studies. You have Gabriel Zuckman. You have a lot of others that has tried to put figures on what's not been exposed, what's not been reported. What I could say is that only recently, when we have the yearly sum up of the voluntary disclosure in Norway, we've seen that the last 2 years is actually having the largest figures ever historically. So there's been an increase. Yeah.
There is an interesting example from Iceland, which you probably are familiar with. The Directorate of Tax Investigation Iceland, they bought information based on Panama Papers from an unknown person for 37 million Icelandic krona. And after months of investigation, the Director of Internal Revenue had demanded almost 500 million kroner in outstanding taxes from 16 individuals. Did the Panama Papers investigation get any money to return to Norway?
The simple question is yes, it did. But I must also say we haven't finished the processing of the cases that we opened in the wake of the Panama Papers. So we had approximately 200 cases altogether, and we will get back with, you could say, the final sums. I don't expect them to be not extremely high, because I think the picture we saw from the cases from the Panama Papers was that we found something, but at least in our case in Norway, it was not substantially, at another level or different than the tedious work that we do from day to day with other international cases. So it was one source that helped us, but I think from our perspective, the most important part of Panama Papers was actually the societal discussion, the fact that you get shedding some light on the international economy and the international transactions in general, and maybe change the general attitude towards secrecy. That I think is the main benefit from our perspective. I'm going to just say one final thing as well on when you asked about developments towards transparency. I also think I moved to Chile. I traveled to Chile on Saturday, and then we're going to spend 3-4 days. I think 53 countries from the OECD discussing issues like this. Maybe not being the most aggressive group when it comes to really moving towards transparency from one day to another, but I think that tedious work as well is very important to actually create that consensus, that minimum of understanding between the countries. So you might move forward, for example, in country-by-country reporting some of these areas.
That's the benefit of heading. You can facilitate it very, very hard. I'll move on to Jon Lomøy, Director General in the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, which we are familiar with as Norad here in Norway. Norway is quite committed to shape the agenda on tax and illicit financial flows. What do you see as the emerging issues and potential drivers that can bring the necessary changes towards more transparency and a better tax system?
Wow, that was a tiny little question. Because I think it's important to realize we have a modest role in this. We're a financier. We're not the driver of policies. We're not the driver of the big international regulations. So I prefer a more modest entry, which is sort of what can we as a development finance institution do to this issue, apart from then of course being happy co-financers of meetings and discussions like this. And I think what we can do, we have a certain agenda setting power, a certain capacity to help influence agenda. So that's one way in which one role we have been playing and which we intend to continue to play. And that happens both in big ways and in small ways. In big ways in major international discussions about development finance and the importance of illicit flows in overall development finance, and the importance of doing something about illicit flows, however technically difficult that may be in relation to. But it then also applies when we get a request from a country, Ghana some years ago, Uganda some years ago, about can you help us manage? We think we've found oil, possibly. Can you help us manage? And what's the type of questions we then ask? What's the type of agenda we then present? What are the type of actors we then bring to the table? And I think that, and there of course, transparency would to us be sort of, and it wouldn't necessarily be there in the original request from the government. That would be more about licensing and about resource mapping and about tax systems and about dealing with revenues from the government's perspective. And we would push that agenda, and we would make it a natural part of the program that international NGOs that work on transparency issues, that local civil society that work on transparency issue, is a natural part of that program, and influences the national discourse in developing countries. Because clearly changes in developing countries must largely happen there, and that means you must bring to the discourse the critical voices that competence-based civil society like you are, but also broad membership-based civil society organizations in developing countries that have a larger social and political capital and possibility to mobilize. And so, and then of course so making it part of the agenda, making partners who focus on this agenda, civil society and media in particular, part of the agenda and of the discourse and of the actors that are involved. And then of course there is the mobilizing the technical capacity that we have, sort of strengthening national technical capacity in developing countries, regardless of, because there's a lot that can be done even with the not perfect or far from perfect international rules that we have at present. Still, we see that there's a lot that can be done, and bringing the expertise of the Norwegian Tax Authority and other sources of competence, making that available to developing country. And then lastly, I think of course, surrounding this is a set of international rules and regulations, largely set in forums that have historically been dominating by our countries. Okay, OECD, I spent 6 years at the OECD. So, and one of the things we are also using our financial power is to help facilitate the inclusion of developing country voices in that global agenda set, in that global norm and standard setting exercise, sort of financing the participation from developing countries in both in the preparation to and in the actual discussion. So I think that's the last way in which we can use our financial the opportunity they have. And if we add this together, we see that we're now back on track in making Norway live up to the pledges that we made in Addis Ababa on how we are going to make increased domestic resource mobilization an important part of our development finance.
We heard recently Professor Joseph Stiglitz saying that basically our own countries, both in Europe and the US, are a huge part of the problem, and we need to deal with a number of policy reforms in order to make it possible for other countries also to get access to information. How does Norad view that? Because on one side it's about international development and in certain countries which are priority countries. On the other hand, much of the problem issues are located in our own countries. What kind of reflections does Norad make on that when it comes to international development?
We're a public agency. Of course, our mandate is not to change Norwegian society. Unfortunately, sometimes as a political animal, of course, I could wish that we had a mandate to try and influence and change Norwegian society, but that's not. So we try to focus more on what can we then, with the instruments and the mandate that we have, actually help move this global agenda forward, and then leave it to you in civil society to make the Minister of Finance and our tax authorities and other more responsive to sort of in the difficult balancing that Hans Christian referred to about sort of what's a good speed here, what's the correct speed, and what are the good technical instruments. That Norwegian discourse, of course, we will not engage in. I can engage as a private citizen, but not as director of Norad.
I'll move over to Trond Eirik Schea. You are the director of Økokrim, the Norwegian National Authority for Investigation and Prosecution of Economic and Environmental Crime. You all have different entry points into the topic of illicit financial flows. Could you just explain to us what is the work that you're doing which is related to international or illicit financial flows?
We are basically an investigational and prosecuting office, so we handle criminal cases, investigate them, and bring them to the courts. So that's what we do. The big cases of corruption and money laundering and tax crime very often are international. And we have to collect information and evidence from several countries, among them tax havens and whatever. And I think on the positive side, So really we use this transparency within the criminal law system, and as you know, traditionally the criminal law system is a very national-based system. So we have had not too strong powers to investigate abroad, as goes with the same way with other countries. And I think during the last quite few years that have changed. It's when you are. I think the subject of transparency is very much the subject of the public having access to information. But when you are first investigating a criminal cause, I think it has become quite easy, I must say, to gather information and evidence from even from a lot of tax havens. So that's basically what we do. The big international cases in Norway tend to start with clever journalists or a clever tax administration, of course. So giving us a starting point, and then when it's into criminal investigation, it's not this big of a challenge as it was some years ago to get to the information or to get to the evidence. So of course, certain countries different, but it's a completely new game as compared to how it was some maybe 10 or 15 years ago.
As a positive development, but we also read on Økokrim's web pages that there is an estimate that around 136 billion Norwegian kroner is being estimated to being avoided of taxation each year. That is still a lot of money. Will you be able to do something about that?
I think, of course, the numbers on how much tax is evaded in Norway would be obviously a question much more for Hans Christian than for Økokrim. But yes, we have stipulated that number, and I think it's obviously too much, far too much money. I think one should. I think we have learned from the past years also that when you are doing this in within the framework of a criminal law, it's something that you shouldn't trust on these criminal cases being the whole medicine on the sanction side, because again, as you know, the criminal law system is a system based on quite strong principles of favor defensionis and the benefit of the doubt and stuff. So this is an arena, I think, and I think we have learned that. And I think also in the big corruption cases and the money laundering cases and tax crime cases, our colleagues abroad also have learned that the scam might be quite bad, but it still might not be sufficient for conviction in a criminal case because of this the system of the law. So I think maybe the modern approach would be also to look for and develop other arenas on sanctioning these kinds of international crime, really.
But the prosecution authority, that's society's maybe one of the biggest ways we can actually test, has something which should not have been going on, has some wrongdoings been taking place. Not all cases come into the court system, but those who do you have the necessary tools to address such cases when they come? Well,
if you look into legal tools, I think, or if you look into what I have been much into on my tenure, which is the international tools, for the international framework, I think it has gotten quite well. We sort of get to the evidence, and it doesn't take this much time. I think maybe I would answer your question well, obviously, in every society, you always have the question of how much resources the society is willing to spend on this kind of. Well, obviously, if you look at Norway, we have quite a lot of important thing to spend the investigation resources on other areas than economic crime. These days, I think it's a question of resource setting also in other countries. And I sort of I think I would add that it's also a question about the public confidence also in the authorities handling the criminal cases. These are cases that have to end in courts either as acquittal or conviction. There is nothing in between. And I think we have learned the past years that you lose some confidence each time you get these acquittals, also in the big cases. So I think, as far as I'm also hearing from my colleagues in Scandinavia, or maybe my colleagues in the northern of Europe, a bit reluctant to, I mean, take for instance a tax crime case. The big tax crime cases is often not a very easy question to say this is a criminal wrongdoing or this is not a criminal wrongdoing. It's the nature of the big tax cases. I think we see these years a kind of reluctance to bring the sort of signal cases or the maybe not absolutely sure cases to the courts, which takes me back to the challenges of having all this confidence in the public confidence in how to find out whether this was wrongdoing or not wrongdoing within the frame of criminal law. There are some obstacles in our arena, so to speak.
I'll move on to the CEO of Finans Norway, Idar Kreutzer. You represent around 240 finance companies here in Norway. What role does the financial sector play in the development of our societies?
We are a part of the problem, and we are a part of the solution. Trond could have mentioned, in addition to investigative journalists and excellent tax enforcers, he could have mentioned Norwegian banks as a source of information of illicit financial transactions. We know and we understand that our members and the core of our business models can be and is being misused for criminal purposes. And as a consequence, we have a responsibility. And we try to take that responsibility extremely seriously, working on it. And the reason, of course, being that, the financial system is a system based on trust. The economic historian Neil Ferguson, he stated in one of his books that the financial system is the most complex man-made structure on the planet. And if you think about it, I think it's right. And that complex structure we are in the middle of. That's the structure we operate. So obviously we are a part of the problem, but we are also a part of the solution. You cannot imagine that you're able to fix the issues you have put on the agenda without the active participation of the financial services sector, the banks and the investors. Before I say anything more about this, let me have one comment about the current cases of money laundering affecting Nordic banks. I will not comment on the cases as such, obviously, but you will not listen to anything I say before I have commented on it. So, because you will think, oh, well, what about these cases? I think there are at least 3 very important learning experiences from these cases. One is that being a small bank in the outskirts of the world does not reduce the risk of being misused. I mean, Danske Bank, it was not the head office in Copenhagen. It was a small, tiny subsidiary or office in Estonia that was misused. So it's the story about the weakest link. That's one story. The other story is that you can have all the systems you want in place, but it's the actual implementation that will decide. Danske Bank had 1,000 full-time employees on compliance. I mean, the structures were probably among the best in Europe when we look at the structures. So it's the weakest link, and being small does not prevent you from being in the risk zone. And Norway, we are a small country in the outskirts of the world, and we have a large number of small banks. We should be aware, and we try to be. The third lesson from this has to do with KYC, know your customer. And you know, the way the system works today, the KYC is a bank thing. And in Norway we have 130 banks. So the bad guys, they are knocking on the door of bank number 1. And they are and the door is not opened. And then they go to bank number 2. And the door is not opened. If the door is opened in bank number 39 or 49 or 65, then they will suddenly have access to the entire system. So one of the things we have to think thoroughly through, together with Trond and his guys and Hans Christian and his guys, is how to develop a system where know your customer is on a higher level. And just to pinpoint, seen from the financial services sector's point of view, to answer your question, what needs to be done? There are 3 levels. One has to do with regulation and legislation, internationally, but also in Norway. And I will come back with one example, if I may. The second has to do with forceful implementation of rules and regulations, both on the public side, but also in the institutions, in the banks, in the financial services institutions. But then point number 3 is law enforcement. I mean, it's not a good thing for financial services that enforcement is weak, because that opens up a large room for the bad guys to do their business. And all the good guys trying to do business in accordance with loose laws and regulation loses out when enforcement is weak. So Trond is our best friend. Hans Christian is our best friend, because they are working in a way which establishes a level playing field for the guys that wants to do legally sound business in open and transparent competition. So I think that's very, very important.
And obviously the business models of some companies, such as the tech giants, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and so, they have hit some businesses or sectors hard, like the media. Mm-hmm. You mentioned banking. These sectors are also looking into banking and other markets, like the insurance industry, which you also represent.
Yes.
Can the same thing happen to your sector?
Absolutely. Not necessarily the same, but let me take the following and try to make it relevant for the case we are discussing here today. The regulation for banking in Europe now is based on an open banking platform. access to information, transparency about flows, access to the underlying information on each customer. So third parties can access the banking system and do transactions, which is seen from a competitive position. It really changed the game. At the same time, we have these large platforms, which are black boxes, closed black boxes, regulated with very different sets of regulation than the banking sector is regulated. And I do think that is an issue. One of the key drivers here when it comes to regulatory framework and legislation should be a level playing field. Open regulation for everybody, not least in payment services, where a part of the problem is. But let me also mention another example, and that has to do with beneficiary ownership. We, as you know, Finance Norway have worked together with Tax Justice Network, developed a set of proposed rules and regulations to improve the framework so that we can find out who is the beneficial owner, which is key for us to report to Trond when we see something that looks strange or should be looked after. And we strongly support that work. We have got a relatively new law in Norway in place. We are not too happy about the law. We think it's too weak, too blurry, and does not do enough. But it is a step on the way. So we have to work together to get rules and regulation that really works and helps us opening up and visualizing the beneficial owners. And that is also a case that we have seen in the money laundering cases that has been exposed in the press now. The UK LLPs, the limited liability partnerships, that was developed with the best of intentions for innovation, entrepreneurship, creating new companies and jobs and value creation, has been misused to cover up underlying structures that's very intransparent and covering illicit financial transactions. So we need to work together, but this is not only an international issue, it's also a national issue, and improvement is important.
I think we actually have to draw the line there because of time issues. So, with no further questions to the panel this time, I think we'll move over to the next session in the program and say thank you very much for commenting on what is needed to make transparency possible. Thank you.